Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Reason Through podcast, a show where we have philosophical discussions and helping you develop and reason through your views. In today's episode, I speak with Dr. Duncan Pritchard. We speak on his work about knowledge, defining what knowledge is, can we have knowledge, when in particular instances do we have knowledge. We also speak on his work done within the prison system about bringing philosophy into the prison system. And then in a much broader sense, we speak on the educational system as a whole. If you find value in what I'm doing, please consider rating, reviewing the podcast, and of course, sharing the podcast as it shows your support, and I'd greatly appreciate it. And without further ado, I bring you Dr. Duncan Pritchard. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Reason Through podcast. Today with me, I have bringing back with us Dr. Duncan Pritchard. Thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Yeah. So just kind of reminding our listeners about who you are and what you do.
So I'm a professor at the University of California, Irvine, so in just south of LA. I'm also director of the Center for Knowledge, Technology and Society as well. And I mainly work in epistemology, which is the sort of theory of knowledge and related issues.
Perfect. And that's kind of what we're gonna kind of shift gears towards a little bit. So just talking about knowledge and its relationship with just kind of how we go about things. We use knowledge in general for a lot of things. I know this. I know I have two hands. Or I know COVID exists. There's also but there's that kind of knowledge. But then there's certain types of usages that are kind of more contextualized, I suppose, like within philosophical circles versus just everyday usage, such as sometimes I've heard knowledge as like a confidence, like I know this is the case, and that's a kind of a confidence thing. But yeah, so why don't you, if you don't mind, kind of going into what you think knowledge is, and how does that kind of apply to our lives and and to our lives.
Yeah. So one thing that we're interested in epistemologists is to work out, when there are lots of cases when we think we know things, but when do we actually know? So there are lots of situations where, you said like people use know in lots of different ways. And for some people, it can just be a way of just saying that they're convinced of something. They might not have very good reasons for why they're convinced, right? So maybe they don't really know, but they have a feeling of knowing. So we're interested in trying to work out what is it actually to know. And the sort of view that I'm interested in, which I think is plausible, is that knowing answers to two main constraints. One is that they're very closely related, but they're not quite the same. One is getting to the truth in a way that's not just luck. So it's like you're sort of latching onto the way things are, and it's not just happenstance that you believe things and they happen to be true. So like a lucky guess isn't knowledge, and it's not knowledge because, well, it's not you latching onto the world or latching onto some fact. It's just like you happen to believe something and it happened to be true. So you've got to get to the truth in a non-lucky way. And then the other element I think is important is about skill. When you know it's due to your cognitive skills in some way, so it's creditable to you that you know. So it's not just that again, the lucky guess illustrates this point too. Like that's a way of getting to you might get to the truth with lucky guesses, but that's not knowledge because it doesn't reflect on you. And the way the two things kind of intersect is that the ability component, this idea of getting to the truth through your agency, we don't want that to be too strong, because if it's too strong, then we can't rely on others, and we do rely on others. It can be that I defer to the expert and appropriately defer to an expert, and in doing so, I come to know things. But then it's not really about my agency so much; it's about the expert's agency. That's why I know. But the thought is, well, look, in those cases, well, your agency is doing something; it's just not doing a lot. And you're in a situation where that's enough to get to the truth in an unlucky way. So that's kind of what knowledge is. Knowledge can sometimes be easy in conditions where things are favorable, where experts are reliable and so on. Then you can know things just by trusting the expert. And indeed, lots of situations you can know things just by trusting your faculties. You wake up in the morning, you open your eyes, you come to know things. It's a friendly environment. You have a route to the truth through your agency, which is very non-lucky. It's going to get you to the truth. Nothing's going to really get in the way. But in other kinds of situations where there's lots of barriers to getting to the truth, knowing can be a lot more difficult. getting to the truth in a non-lucky way, getting there through your skills, can demand quite a lot of skill. I mean, I think this is very relevant to, we live in this modern information saturated time. Very difficult to know who are the experts exactly. On Twitter, who should I trust? Who should I believe, and so on. And I think this is, those kind of environments. They're epistemically unfriendly. It's hard in these cases to get to the truth. And here it demands a lot of us in terms of our agency. So getting to the truth in a skillful and non-lucky way actually is quite demanding. So that's the way I think about knowledge, and I call it an anti-luck virtue epistemology. Virtue just means skill. There's a skill element, and there's a getting to the truth in a way that's not lucky.
Yeah, and this would you say like this is kind of in response to certain? I think you in your work you have you mentioned it like kind of Gettiyerized situations because traditionally like the traditional analysis of what knowledge is justified true belief, um, and that's what gives you knowledge. And then you have these kind of Gettier situations where there's something you're kind of right just by luck, or the belief just happens to be correct just by luck, and it has nothing to do with your with the components that it's been traditionally kind of identified with.
Yeah, I mean, let me give you a famous Gettier case that I like. It's due to Roderick Chisholm. You have a farmer looks into a field, and they see a sheep-shaped object, something that looks just like a sheep, and so they believe there's a sheep in the field. And they're entirely appropriate for them to believe that, right? It does look like a sheep. They're a farmer. They know what sheep looks like. Conditions are good, and so on. The twist in the tale, though, is what they're looking at is just like a big hairy dog or something. But behind the big hairy dog is a real sheep. So there is a sheep in the field. Their belief is true, but it's not true that the belief, their reasons, as it were, don't connect up with the world. And that's a Gettier case. And what's interesting about it is it's not like a lucky guess or something like that. The farmer's belief is justified, it's reasonable, it's rational for them to believe what they do. And indeed, it's also true. But the truth of the belief and the rationality, the reasons are disconnected in an important way. It's just a matter of luck that their belief is true, given their reasons. And so that's why you want to have some kind of explanatory connection between the facts and your agency. So it's got to be that you're getting to the truth through your agency in the sense that you have a true belief is partly explained by your agency. In the farmer case, that's not what's happening. I mean, the truth of the farmer's belief is explained by the happenstance that there's a sheep hidden in the field. It's not explained by the farmer being a good sheep spotter. But imagine if the farmer was looking at a real sheep. Well, then the truth of their belief would be explained by them seeing the sheep, by them having, the eyesight and ability to spot sheep in fields and so on. So yeah, the Gettier style cases, they're a good way of illustrating this worry about luck. That even if you believe things in appropriate ways, it can still be the case that your belief is true, but it's just a matter of luck. Your belief is true, and that's not knowledge in that case. You don't get to knowledge through luck.
Yeah, I guess I have two kind of question, or one's a question, one's more kind of a response. Can one um, reject those kinds of situations? Because like when you're setting up a thought experiment and kind of something like that, it's I kind of well, one response I can see someone who wants to maintain that knowledge is justified true belief could just say like, well, I don't. They could just reject the thought experiment and say that we're never really in those cases. Most of the time, we're in these other cases to where we can attain these knowledge. Is that something that has been in the literature where people have rejected kind of the Gettier kind of style thought experiments?
Yeah, well, you couldn't reject it for that reason because Gettier cases happen all the while. In fact, it's a really interesting thing. Once you are aware of Gettier cases, you spot them all over the place. In fact, this is one of the things when I teach this, I always say to my students, right, your project for this week is to look out for a real life Gettier case, and people come back with lots of them. They're everywhere. So yeah, if there was something in the nature of them that they were really unlikely or whatever, then I guess maybe someone could say perhaps knowledge should be tolerant. We just attribute knowledge in those cases, but actually they're quite widespread. So that wouldn't work. There are some responses to, I mean, as with any thought experiment, you can always reject you can say there's something wrong with the experiment or something wrong with what it's meant to show. Not so much in that case, but there are other kinds of cases where so we'll take the sheep case. You could say, well, what is the farmer's belief? Is it there's a belief there's a sheep in the field, or is it there's a belief that that's a sheep?
Mm.
Because if the belief is that that's a sheep, then that belief isn't justified, right? I mean, it's like because they don't see. Sorry, more specifically, that belief isn't even true, right?
Mhm.
right? Because that isn't a sheep. That's a big hairy dog, and
Mhm,
so on. So you could try to get out of it that way. I mean, the problem is you're kind of doing, as they say, straining to do some explaining.
mhm.
You kind of have to do some gymnastics, as it were. So now we've got to say, well, no, the sheep farmer doesn't really believe there's a sheep in the field. They believe that that's a sheep. So you've been very specific about the content of their beliefs, and that feels a bit ad hoc. Why doesn't the farmer just believe there's a sheep in the field? And if they do, then the problem reemerges, and so on. And
Yeah.
there's been some other lines. I mean, yeah, I mean, it gets quite the Gettier literature is quite interesting because when it was first proposed, there was about a decade of people. Usually, when you get a thought experiment like this, people just try and tweak the view, and there were lots of attempts to sort of tweak the view, and this went on for about a decade. Lots, and the attempts got more and more sophisticated, and the responses got more and more sophisticated until I think gradually people realised this isn't the kind of problem that we're going to get out of by
Yeah.
tweaking the view.
Mhm,
Um, and then that makes it a very interesting thought experiments because usually there is a line. Maybe it's not a
mhm.
plausible one, but there is a line which people might take. It's a
Mhm.
route, but it's kind of that's not really happened. And all credit to Gettier. As I'm sure you know the story. He only really wrote one thing,
Yeah.
and it was this. It was a 3-page article. Again.
Yep.
So to come up with a case which actually has that longevity built into it
Mhm.
is
Yes, yeah, and kind of especially how that's been like that was the traditional analysis for a really long time of that is just that this is what knowledge is. And then you have him writing, I think it was like a small piece of paper, or not a small piece, but like a little one-page paper of something like this that's kind of been lasting. I guess that's kind of where when I kind of found out about Gettier and then read about kind of a little bit more on introductory philosophy for epistemology, my mind it kind of what's interesting is that my mind starts going to like, well, okay, who cares about knowledge then? Maybe we just can't have knowledge, or is knowledge really that valuable at this point? Maybe what matters really is just justification and then the belief. That's what seems to matter more. And so I kind of want to move forward a little bit with that because now you've written your whole segment or the book that I picked up from you um, about that why knowledge is actually valuable, and then kind of trying to argue that it's not just instrumentally valuable. It's kind of there's a final value to it. So yeah, we can move into that kind of segment.
yeah. So I think that the part of the value of knowledge relates to it's because we care about the truth, and when we know, it's like we've sort of in a really profound way we've latched onto the truth. So think about the Gettier case. You've got the truth, your belief is true, but you haven't really latched onto the truth, right? It's kind of there's a kind of disconnect between your reasons and the truth. The farmer does have a true belief there's a sheep in the field, but for all the wrong reasons. And in fact, actually, this is going to matter. It may not matter in that moment, um, but given that what he thinks he's looking at and what he is looking at aren't the same thing, then he's likely to get into error in ways he wouldn't have got into error if he'd known there was a sheep there. If that sheep hidden from view wanders away, then his belief is no longer true, but he'll carry on believing it, right? Because the big hairy dog will still be there, and so on. So he's as it were, he's very error is very close for him. It could easily happen in a way that when error isn't very nearly close. So it's like knowing is it's not just throwing out a belief and it latches onto the truth. It's like actually just getting a grip on the truth. And I think that relates to why we care about it. It certainly relates to its practical utility, its instrumental utility. Knowledge is useful to us because it has a kind of stability. It's not just mere true beliefs alone. If they're not knowledge, they lack that. And this is point actually goes back to Plato. Uh, Plato has a nice little. He has Socrates give a nice little analogy of the statues of Daedalus. Statues of Daedalus. These were statues that were so lifelike, and they were like statues in action, sort of thing. They looked like they were about to move. And the thought was they're so lifelike that if you didn't tie them down, it's kind of a joke. If you didn't tie them down, they would run away. And Socrates makes a point that mere true belief is a bit like this. It's like mere true belief is like it's belief that's not tied down, and knowledge is tied down. So it's apt to sort of run away. It's apt to be lost. So um, the case he gives is what's the difference between knowing the road to Larissa, which is a place in Greece, and as opposed to just merely having a true belief. He says, well, both of them get you to Larissa, but knowing the route to Larissa is going to give you a more stable way of getting to Larissa than merely on a true belief. I mean, imagine you're on the road. Imagine it's guesswork, which happens to be right, but you're on the road and the road takes a surprising turn. Now you might lose your belief. You might doubt yourself and so on. But if you've got a map, Yeah, and maybe that's your way of knowing. Then you can look at the map and say, oh well, this is why it goes that way, and so on. And in general, knowing it's kind of like it's a tethered down way of getting to the truth, and that's what gives it a special kind of practical value. It may be that in the particular instance, knowing and merely having a true belief or justified true belief doesn't make that much practical difference, but over the long term, so and over the medium term even, it can make a big difference knowing things. So that's part of its practical use. And then the question becomes, well, is there more to knowing than just its practical use? One of the interesting features of the ancient world, particularly ancient Greece, is that knowledge was highly prized. I mean, there's very few. I mean, for some philosophers, it's the most prized thing, but it's certainly up there. You know, the things that are valorized as being special value, truth, beauty, and so on. Knowledge is definitely one of these things. One thing that's interesting about this, though, is that they didn't have our word knowledge, as it were, doesn't map on very neatly to some of these categories they had. Like they had words like esteem, techne, gnosis, nous, and so on. These they map in a way that's more sophisticated. They have all different ways of knowing. And it seems that when they say knowledge is special value, they mean a particular kind of knowing. And I think that they're onto something here. So knowledge in general, I don't think is a final value, because sometimes things are pretty trivial, and sometimes things are pretty easy, and so forth. But I think there are kinds of knowing which are special value, and I think this is where the intellectual virtues come in. If you get to the truth through your intellectual virtues, then I think the special value of the intellectual virtues confers a special value to the knowledge. So, for example, I don't think you can have trivial knowledge. You wouldn't have trivial or unimportant knowledge through the virtues. You don't even have knowledge of important things, because that's what virtuous people care about. They don't care about trivia, or don't especially care about trivia. And then the other issue here, which is connects slightly orthogonal, is if you get to the truth through your abilities, primarily through your abilities, then that has a special kind of a value, because it's an achievement, and achievements have a special kind of value. I think we understand this. Like the good life is it's not just a life of successes. One would hope that one has some successes, right? That one strives for things and one is successful. But imagine that you have a life of striving for things and successful, but your successes are always brought about by some external agency. Like you have a rich parent that always makes it such that they always engineer behind the scenes that you're successful. That's kind of like that's, you want to get there by your own steam. It's not enough to magically appear at the top of the mountain. You've got to climb it, right, and so on. So achievements have a special kind of value, but achievements are ways of getting to your goal through your agency, and not just through happenstance or through external agency. And I think in the cognitive case, that's getting to the truth through your cognitive steam.
Now,
There's a value to working out things for yourself, and not just simply believing what someone tells you, and so on. And I think
yeah,
in those kind of cases, knowledge has a special value because it's a kind of achievement, and achievements have a special kind of value.
yeah, and so I think what you're in the book when you said that cognitive achievements alone, I think, couldn't get you there. You need that extra condition of like the intellectual virtues. That piece needs to be there, and the intellectual virtues are, I think you had worded, are as a kind of a cognitive achievement, and then that's kind of what's kind of giving the that final ground, not final grounding, the final value.
Yeah.
Um, okay,
So maybe I should explain. So final value is when something's finally valuable, it's valuable for its own sake. Most things are instrumentally valuable. They're valuable as a means to something else. So money is the classic case of this. Money isn't valuable in itself, right? If you thought that, then you've made a mistake. Like, so the miser thinks that, and they make a mistake, right? So there's those pictures, famous pictures, like of the miser surrounded. They're in rags, living in a hovel, but they're surrounded by gold, and they're thin and ailing and so on. They've misunderstood. They've made an error of value. They think it's money. It's what money gets you that's valuable, not the money. So lots of things are instrumentally valuable, but some things, and these are a really interesting category of things. Some things presumably are valuable for their own sake. In fact, really interesting here, if nothing is valuable for its own sake, then nothing is valuable, really. Because instrumental value only makes sense if there's something that's there's some final value somewhere, right? It can't be that everything's instrumentally valuable. Then to say everything's instrumentally valuable is say nothing is valuable, right? Because it's a means to something else, but there's no
Yeah,
something else.
it's only valuable because of other things that it brings. Yeah.
So final values are really interesting. We need to know what they are. It's very important to us. And one thought, one plausible thought is that, well, so the good life, right? The Greeks thought the life of eudaimonia, of human flourishing, that's good for its own sake. It's and related to that, they thought the virtues were good for their own sake. It doesn't. I mean, they're practically good as well, right? And the good life is practically good too. But it's more than that. It has a goodness that transcends that. It's good for its own, independently of its instrumental value. And the thought is that achievements, certainly what I call strong achievements, which is where you've actively overcome obstacles, or you have very high levels of skill on display. They seem to have a special kind of value. They seem valuable for their own sake. We treat them differently to other kinds of things, and it seems we're right to do so. So it seems like there are some things in play here, some values in play, which are different to the other kinds of values because they're valuable for their own sake and not for the sake of something else.
Yeah. Do you want to kind of highlight a little bit of the what are the intellectual virtues, what they are traditionally or contemporary?
Yeah. So uh, in general, intellectual. So the virtues in general are admirable character traits. So they're traits of character which we admire in people. The intellectual virtues are the character traits which are geared towards the truth in some broad sense. So or inquiry in some broad sense. So and it gets a bit tricky here because some of the virtues kind of overlap. So there might be like a moral virtue of being kind or something like that, and then there may be some virtues like being courageous, where you can be morally courageous, you can be physically courageous, but you can also be intellectually courageous, right? There can be an intellectual aspect to it. And a lot of the intellectual virtues are like that. So like humility is a virtue, and intellectual humility seems to be a kind of humility which is geared towards the truth, being open to counter arguments, being willing to listen to others, recognizing one's own fallibility and so on. I think curiosity is a virtue. Or at least there's a kind of curiosity that's a virtue. Some other examples: tenacity and intellect. So again, being tenacious can be a virtue. Being intellectually tenacious, like you don't just give up when you encounter intellectual obstacles. We think of great scientists; they often have this feature of being intellectually tenacious. They keep going, as it were. And what's interesting about the virtues, by the way, they all lie between two vices: a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency. And that's so take tenacity. The vice of excess would be, like in the intellectual case, would be, keeping going with the inquiry even when it's clearly hopeless. That'd be a kind of dogmatism. That'd be silly. And the vice of deficiency would just be just giving up, the first sign of an obstacle and so on. And so the wise person who has the Greeks call practical wisdom, phronesis, they have the good judgment to navigate between those two vices. Or another case, curiosity. I mean, the virtue of curiosity isn't just asking lots of questions, right? There's a kind of excess. There's a vice of excess here. Someone who just asks lots of questions, regardless of their relevance and so on, that's kind of a vice. That's just a waste of everyone's time and their own time. I mean, and the vice of deficiency would just be not being curious. What we want to nurture in people is this golden mean, as it's known, between the two vices, where you have your virtues to the right degree, and that requires good judgment. So that's what the virtuous character has. So the intellectual virtues, they're guided by the truth. The intellectually virtuous person cares about the truth. They desire the truth. For them, it's something important, and this is revealed in how they behave. And I think we all know intellectually. I think we all know virtuous people to some degree. I mean, it's a paradigm. It's a paragon. So we all approximate, but there may not be like a perfectly virtuous person, but there are people who approximate to it. And how you acquire the virtues, incidentally, and this is Aristotle's view, I think it's broadly plausible, is ideally by being around virtuous people and emulating them. It's like you just And that's often, I think, what we do. People who thrive and do well. Often you can see them. They have close attachments to people who also knew how to thrive and were wise and so on, and that's what helps them to develop it. And equally, we see other people. There are certain kinds of people who have the misfortune not to be surrounded by people who have virtues, but to be surrounded by people who have vices, and it's really hard then to acquire the virtues. It's very hard to acquire them in isolation. Um, it's possible, but it's not. It's very hard.
Yeah.
So
Um,
that's how they're acquired, and that's what they're.
yeah, and so like the virtues, exemplifying the virtues, leads one's life to flourish. And that's kind of like the main thing that's kind of the for the Greeks and kind of about what kind of virtue ethics is kind of really about. Um, Interesting enough, like when you had mentioned about developing those intellectual virtues and just the kind of the virtues in general, being surrounded by that, it seems as if that's what school or education, kind of should be aimed at. And I think I've thought like that for a little bit of time where so like in school, they're kind of just drumming down of like, here are the facts, here are factual things, and then practicing the facts and then memorizing those facts. And then they're teaching you they're wanting to teach critical thinking, but I think you have written, and I think in large part I agree, where it's you can have critical thinking skills, but not exemplify intellectual virtues. And so it's kind of like that, or at least that's how we're kind of, at least in the U.S. from my experience, that's what I've been seeing, and not really teaching you how to think, but just teaching you, in some sense, what to think, and then how to kind of solve problems that may be a practical use, but not like living like a flourishing life or exemplifying kind of those think not think properly, but how to think.
Well, yeah. So I think this is a major issue with education has become increasingly instrumentalized, like in the sense that it's geared towards very specific things. I think students view it that way. Uh, Even at university, I think one thing. So there's a project I'm involved in at UCI, which is all about bringing the intellectual virtues into the curriculum. And what we're trying to do is get students to see that their education isn't just what they learn in class. Yeah, I mean, education in its fullest sense is the cultivation of you as a person and your character. So sure, I mean, we want you to learn. We want you to learn facts and skills and so on. But as it were, there's a broader goal to education if it's done well. And I hope we do it well. Which is to cultivate you as a person. That means in part to develop your intellectual virtues. And so what we're trying to get students to see is how when they learn things and how they engage. So on this model, education never ends, as it were. I mean, maybe there are formal periods of instruction and so on, but it's to be part of that lifelong process of learning and developing and cultivating oneself, and trying to see how what you learn, the specific things you learn, the facts, skills, and so on, how they relate into that. For example, when one has obstacles to one's learning, is one tenacious, or is one give up? Is one driven to learn by one's curiosity? When one argues with another, is it because one cares about the truth and wants to get there, or is it just because you want to score points over your opponent and so on? And this relates to your point about critical thinking. I mean, there's a danger with critical thinking that we kind of train people up just to be good arguers, but that's not really what it's about. We should learn how to argue in a way which is respectful of others, because we care about the truth, and we're part of a collective enterprise to find out things. I think one thing that's gone wrong with the Twitterverse is that we don't care anymore about the truth. There's a lot of people who really don't care, and they don't care about other people and what they think or anything like that. They just want to win or score points or whatever you. And that's the life of flourishing does not lie there, right?
Yeah, just definitely. I mean, part of it is like like what you're talking about, like just misrepresenting someone's views deliberately, or just kind of what you're saying, just going back and forth and not wanting to engage. I guess what I would call honestly
Yeah.
about certain topics. As far as the education goes, though, it kind of you definitely see kind of like that Aristotelian kind of like telos, like what's the point of the university? And that's part of its purpose, is to cultivate the character of the individual. And because I mean, back when I was in college and in undergrad, I had plenty of um, peers that were just like they're just trying to get through it, but it's also just a piece of paper. I have people that I know people that have that same view, like, well, college is just going there, it's part of the system, explain, where we have this system, get into debt, it's just about a piece of paper, and that's kind of what we're valuing. But then there's this also component that's something where I learned. Well, I'm like, I kind of like going to college because I like to learn and I want to, learn about different things and, um, in some sense, cultivate kind of the way I think about things and how I process information because it's very easy to just kind of be in those echo chambers and
Yeah.
just kind of feed into um, those ideas and not listen to someone charitably or just listen to someone honestly and trying to, what you're saying, kind of get at truth.
Yeah. And I think one thing that's interesting about this that even though I care about the intellectual virtues, I think they're finally valuable. They help people to flourish. They're also very practically useful too. I
Mhm.
mean, I think increasingly so. In the modern age, a lot of skills are going to get replaced by technology, and that's just a fact. A lot of people are going to live longer. They're going to need to have to learn lots of different kinds of skills at different points. There are lots of careers that, there are careers that will be around 25 years from now. We don't even know about yet. Um, so the kind of people we want, in a sense, we want to teach people facts and skills, but really that's kind of, a lot of that's going to be redundant, and a lot of what makes someone employable isn't really about that. It's about their, are they adaptable? Are they curious? Are they tenacious? Can they argue well? Do they get to the truth of things? Do they flourish as people? So, although that's not my primary interest, is to get people into positions of employment, although I do think it's really important. But sometimes people think that this stuff is kind of like fluff or something. It's not really part of the core educational enterprise. I think it's the other way around. This is core. This is what we need. If you going to university and just learning facts and skills and not learning the other stuff is not going to be that useful to you over the long term.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting take, like where if that's the purpose of school, it's kind of like the purpose of school, or maybe there's a movement a long time ago. I'm not sure at what point where school just kind of broke away from like distinguishing other things. So, like, here's an example: school doesn't typically focus on, at least from my experience, school wasn't really focusing on what trying to cultivate what I like to do, and I had to learn what I like and learn the things that I like about myself through outside of school and just experience and as me growing as an individual thinking about like I really like this is what I really found that I enjoy, this is who I am, or this is why I may do the things I do. That's typically seen as like that's outside of school boundary,
Yeah, yeah,
and because that's not a place for school. And it kind of goes into a little bit where like, well, okay, so you have academic education, that's fine, but then there's also moral education. There's other different types of education that's kind of not being gathered in the school. And then I guess it goes into, well, how do you teach that? Or, like there's a how would you kind of change that paradigm? Because that's kind of what it is right now, it seems. And then, like there's a practical problem of like, well, how do we teach our children this? And then you have the other problem where like, well, whose values are we teaching? And then things like that a little bit. So yeah, I don't know. What do you think about kind of that? And,
there's a great American philosopher, John Dewey, who talks about this, and he thinks that education really is an emancipatory project. It's not really about teaching content, right? I mean, you do teach content, but it's really about emancipating the individual. It's a kind of freedom. That's when it's done well. And then we should be very wary about education as being geared just towards getting knowledge, fact, skills, whatever. Because that's kind of if we gear it that way, that becomes contrary to this emancipatory element to freedom. And I think what you were talking about there, about education as a way of finding oneself, finding what one cares about, and so forth, developing oneself, fits very nicely with the way of thinking of the virtues. And I mean, I talk about the ancient Greeks, but actually, most traditions have something similar to the virtues. I think this is kind of like it's sort of ancient wisdom recognized across the world. You find it Confucian tradition has something very similar to the virtues, for example. But it seems like the modern society is increasingly geared more towards thinking of education in purely instrumental terms. Probably because we're in a capitalist society, and that's probably how we think about things. But I think we should resist it because I think it's contrary to our flourishing as human beings, as Dewey said.
yeah, definitely. And so I kind of want to segue now that we're kind of talking more about intellectual virtues and like kind of that kind of education. There's some work that you've written on that I find fascinating, and this is kind of bringing like the intellectual virtues into kind of the prison system. And then you've done this, or you've wrote about it. I think it was in for the UK, and then I think you're starting some projects, but kind of just mainly we can talk about that, and then kind of like why do that, and how does that work out in practice?
Yeah. So I mean, it's one of these really interesting to me is like if we think the virtues are so important educationally, then obviously that has direct practical implications. We should do it, right? If we believe it, we should do it. And so a lot of philosophers have been trying to bring the virtues into schools. In fact, there's a really interesting middle school and high school just up from here in Long Beach, which the philosopher Jason Bear was involved in founding. Which the whole curriculum is geared around the intellectual virtues. It's called the Intellectual Virtues Academy. Which I think is just fantastic, and it's kind of school I wish I had gone to because it looks amazing. And
Yeah.
there've been other ways of doing that. I mean, I've done a little bit of this, bringing the virtues into primary schools and so on. I mean, one thing's great is that a lot of these techniques of trying to teach for virtue, they don't presuppose any kind of factual knowledge. The ways of doing it, they don't presuppose any factual knowledge. So you go in a very young age, 7-year-olds even, and do exercises. In fact, maybe the 7-year-olds are perhaps the best age to do it. So there's been various levels people have been trying to do this. As I say, I'm trying to do this similar project at the university. But one place where we've looked into it is prisons. And in Scotland, this is going back a few years, I used to be based at the University of Edinburgh. We were horrified to find there's next to no education in Scottish prisons. I mean, I think America actually does a lot better. You have proper education programs here. So long-term prisoners in Scotland, so short-term prisoners have no education at all. Long-term prisoners have some education, but it's mostly art classes and cognitive behavioral therapy. That's what their education is. And so there are people trying to get into prisons to do something a bit more useful for long-term prisoners. And so we hit on the idea of depending who we talked to, we either said it was philosophy or critical thinking, but whatever was the most useful way of presenting it. Some people like critical thinking more than philosophy and vice versa. But basically, it was about teaching for the virtues. And part of the thinking behind this is that, so in prisons, I'm sure this is true everywhere, it's definitely true in Scotland, the educational background of prisoners, especially long-term prisoners, is very variable. You can't presuppose anything, really. You can't presuppose even that they can read and write. Often there's people from very impoverished backgrounds, as you'd expect in prisons. So you need a style of education, and I think it's one of the reasons why there isn't much education in prison. But you need a style of education that doesn't presuppose. You can't just go in there and start, teaching Aristotle or something. So we used a methodology. It's called Community of Philosophical Inquiry. In fact, it derives its roots from Dewey, who I mentioned earlier. And it's primarily used for children, actually. But there's no I've used it with university students. It's a way of doing kind of critical thinking where it's not focused on any topics or anything like that. You don't have to know anything. You don't have to write anything down. You don't have to read anything. They're just exercises, and they're exercises that you do as a group, and it helps people to focus on reasoning in its purest form. So, here's give you a little flavor of it. Like members of the group, they're not allowed to use their own name. You have to pick a name. There's a reason for this. You want to get people to abstract away from their own individual case. It turns out this is very important in prisons. Prisoners have this tendency to start talking about why they're there. So we work with these educators who know the prisoners and have been there for a long time, and that's one of their big challenges: is stop them just talking about why they're there, and get them to focus on the task in hand. So this aspect of it, pick a name, actually worked very well. And there's certain moves you're allowed to make. So you pose puzzles, questions, and so on, and then there's certain moves you can't just assert something. You've got to give reasons. If you object to what someone else says, you've got to first restate what they say and what their reasons are and so on. And the idea is it makes people reflect very clearly what are reasons, and what are my reasons and why do I think what I do and so on. And we had people doing these exercises, and then alongside it, we had a study going where, essentially we were setting people critical thinking tasks, and then we were just, as a group, and then just seeing what they did. And it was interesting. At the beginning, they did nothing. They just didn't have a clue. And then, but as they moved along, because it wasn't solving the problem that was interesting. It was what they did, right? As they moved along, we could see that they would start to verbalize, they articulate reasons, they come up with strategies for solving the problem. Moreover, they would collaborate with each other. So they would correctly articulate other people's reasons and so on, come up with shared strategies and things like that. And by the end, they were like, a tight, cohesive problem-solving unit. so massive increase in their problem solving abilities. And that was what we were interested in. And this had a huge effect on their life. I mean, it was actually pretty stunning. We've done 2 rounds of this, and it's been further rounds since I've since left to come here, but it's still ongoing now. It's like now a feature of the furniture, as it were, of Scottish prisons. They have this uh, critical thinking program embedded into their education, long-term prisoners. But for example, the testimonials from the prisoners were things really interesting. Things like prisoners would say things like, well, that they realized that the violent situations they got into in the past were often arose because of a failure to understand their own reasons and misunderstanding of others and so on. And it brought home to me something really interesting, which I mentioned earlier about, if you're raised around virtuous people, then it's easier to be virtuous. And if you're not, it's harder. When you got listen to the testimonials from the prisoners, it was very interesting about how the way they'd been raised. So they've been raised, for example, to think that you know objecting to something is kind of like is like a sort of physical that's like a physical challenge that can lead to violence. If you don't thinking about things is frowned upon, and so on. They're not raised in a way which promotes what you might call the space of reasons. And many of us are, and we sort of take that for granted in better or worse extent. But some people aren't. And if you're not raised around that, then I think it can have a disastrous effect on one's life. Not just that one doesn't flourish, but one actually has severe negative implications. We did a male prison and a female prison. In the female prison, it was quite heartbreaking. Some of the testimonials. The female prison, many of them saying that no one had ever listened to anything they had to say before. So it was revelatory. Like having a conversation about why they think things. So it was really, we didn't expect it to have quite the dramatic effects that it had, but actually, when you think about it, it kind of makes sense. It's people in prisons are often the most disadvantaged people of all, and they've missed out, on a kind of education in the broad sense that many of us, I think, take for granted, and this has had very negative implications for their lives. If you're interested, by the way, in some of the things we used to do, there's so for example, like there's a strategy called 4 tables. So you split the table into 4, and then you have things. People have to categorize things in terms of whether they're real and they present themselves as real, or whether they're fake and they present themselves as fake, or they're real and present themselves fake, present themselves as real. And then you stay maybe like at a toy tank. Right? Where does the toy tank go? It's really interesting. Right? Does it go? It's not pretending to be a real tank, right?
Mhm.
You're not going to mistake it for a real tank, but it's not a tank, right? It's kind
Yeah.
of like, or a plastic flower. Well, it's not a real flower, but I guess you might think that it's a real flower, right?
Mhm.
So it's deceptive, and it's really interesting. You can get the purpose of the strategy isn't so much to get answers; it's to get people thinking
Yeah.
and to articulate their thoughts to others, and to recognize other people's thinking and respond accordingly. So, and you can see people developing. In this case, for example, people who engage with this task, they start to recognize that when we talk about the real, as it were, has multiple contrasts: the real and the fake, the real and the deceptive, the real and the inauthentic, and so on. They're not quite the same, and you can draw that out by discussing different ways in which something could not be real. But yeah, so that's a really deep philosophical topic.
Yeah.
But you don't have to do it in an abstract way, right? You can just do it by talking about a little toy tank and what kind of where does it go on this table?
Yeah. It's so fascinating too, because I think when I'm reading it, what I really definitely like in at least just like the way you guys started off, which is like having just kind of like a pseudonym, you know, um, it kind of breaks away bias and identity and strips away that detaches that oneself from that engaging. Like and especially kind of the tribal mentality, like you're this, so I'm gonna put you in this category. Um, but what I definitely like about it, kind of what you're saying with that exercise, it's not teaching about like the content, right? Because like in when someone says, "Hey, let's teach philosophy in prisons," you're kind of like, "Well, why would we do that?" That's just there's no purpose for it. It has no value. There's no practical value from it. But then when you kind of distinguish between, well, there's a content. That's kind of what we see in the academy. But then there's also this sensibility kind of use of philosophy, which is kind of what you're doing. Um, teaching people how to reason and identifying their own reasons and identifying the reasons in others and allowing that space to kind of be cultivated. Um, because I feel like in today's day, especially today's day and age, it's hard to when I've engaged with people, or I kind of this is why I also stop engaging with people because either they're not providing the reasons or they're not being they're not appreciating my reasons for giving whatever I view. Um, and so where it just makes me want to, okay, I'm going to back off. I'm going to go to other people that are a little bit more appreciative of that.
It's interesting that it's very democratizing. So in the prisoners came in with a really strict hierarchy. There's people at the beginning. There's people who speak and people who don't speak, particularly in the male prison. And there's people who shut up as soon as someone else speaks, and so on. Because we recorded, we did a sort of speech analysis on some of the interactions, so you can see this quite vividly. But over time, it's democratic. Over time, it evens out. Over time, everyone's speaking. Over time, it flattens. And I think this is really, I mean, this is something Dewey talks about. This democratizing feature of education when it's done well. Like it's lifting everybody up, and it's keeping, and everybody's the hierarchies are being broken down. Interesting, by the way, about the names. So it strips away from identity, but there's a study in and of itself. The names the men chose, and the names women chose. In the men's prison, the names are all things like Thor. yeah, there's nothing like that in the female prison, right? So there's a whole project
Yeah.
there, I think, of
Yeah.
let people choose their own names and look at what they
What
choose.
they choose. Yeah.
It's really revealing. Yeah, but it's very democratizing, and I think that's and also, by the way, we were focused on the intellectual virtues, but actually, you can't just something point Aristotle makes. Virtue is integrated, so you can't develop character and just develop one bit of it. When you
Mm.
develop one bit of it, you develop the whole. And the fact these people start to care about the truth, and
Mhm.
it means they start to care about reasons, and they start to care about each other.
Mhm.
They respect each other, right? Because that's part of what respecting the truth is respecting other people and their reasons. Um, so there's a kind of socialization that occurs. There are moral virtues start to get developed as they develop the intellectual virtues, and yeah. So even though we weren't focused on that, I thought that was interesting. That there was this kind of socialization, and people were treating other people better. So there's an ethical consequence to it.
Yeah, and I think in some of the testimonies that I read, you had mentioned it had mentioned that some of them they applied it not just within the prison system or their time there. At least they were talking about where they also could apply it.
Yeah.
Um, and so what I kind of like about this is that at least this kind of structure or this methodology is that it's a top down process in the sense that like you have an institution that is has this like kind of method or program that's in place, but it's also bottom up where um, it's not just going to affect things going on like one so for example let's say it's taught in the institution, presumably those students when they have families of their own they're um, still exemplifying, or we would at least ideally they would be exemplifying those virtues and continue that, and then it kind of goes down from like generation, and then they go back to the academy and do that. So that's like it's a top down process but also a bottom up process into where you can kind of have a long lasting effect that's not too intrusive to where it's violating people's autonomy, but it's also building that habit um, to kind of change behavior to a more meaningful or valued life.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a if you excuse the pun, a virtuous cycle.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So kind of when you first implemented the program, was there a lot of pushback to do that program? And then that's one question. The second question is if you can talk about if you're how that's going on here now that you're back in kind of in the US.
so yeah, I mean, actually, pushback, but not funny of a different kind. So getting ethics permission. I mean, there are practicalities of setting something like this up. You can't just obviously can't just go to a prison and just turn up. I mean, it's hard enough just to turn up at schools, but prisons. You want to take students into a prison. I mean, you can imagine the ethics permissions involved in doing that. No, not easy. And there's lots of practical hurdles that we had to clear. I mean, I should say that the people running this, they're already prison educated, so we had to train them up because they have a relationship with the prisoners, and that's really important. You couldn't just send in an academic into a prison, right? it would take you weeks to form the relationships. They'd be very resistant. They're very resistant to anyone they see as authority and so on. So you've got to really think strategically about how you're going to get in there. And the way we did it was take these people already involved in prison education and train them up, and then build them into the study. So we've got people in there already have the relationship. So, but not much pushback. We expected more. I mean, one thing I was very all nervous about was that if the press got hold of the fact that we're teaching philosophy in prison, because bear in mind these are long-term prisoners, so we didn't know what they'd done, but it often, in some cases, you couldn't help but find out. They're murderers, rapists. People have done terrible things, right? That's the nature. They're long-term prisoners. They're not. They aren't minor things. They're usually violent things that they've done. So there is. You can imagine people say, well, why these resources? Even though it was all kind of extracurricular, we're all doing it as on a volunteer basis. But you can imagine, why are these resources going into prisons to, people who've done these terrible things? And luckily that never happened. But I think, had that happened, who knows what? I mean, would the whole plug would have been pulled? I don't know. But we really needed to get to the point where we'd done it and we got positive results. So then we could then extend it, which it was extended into more prisons. And now that it's established, I think it's pretty stable. I would hope that there's no more pushback. Interesting, by the way, we had to do all this ethics permission, but all the ethics permission was all focused on us and dangers that we might be exposed to. And no one, it's funny, I gave a talk on this at UConn, and someone said, what about the prisoners? What about them? And no one asked about them. But actually, in the end, it worked out really well for them. Maybe it couldn't have, maybe democratizing people is not a good thing in prison. Maybe it's going to get them into trouble. I mean, it didn't, but I now in retrospect, I realize we should have thought more about that actually. Whether there could have been harmful effects. I mean, the only focus from the ethics point of view was about issues of privacy and so on, data. But no, I don't remember anyone asking, well, what if this isn't good for them? So it is good, but I mean, yeah, there is a worry there. In terms of moving forward, there's a project at UCI getting to the American situation is very different because there is established programs of education in
I see.
prison. So it's a case of enhancing that. I mean, the thing we're trying to do here at UCI is try and make degree programs for prisoners. But what I'd quite like to do is to find a way to get this virtues program. It's what's called the Anteater Virtues. Peter the Anteater's our mascot here at UCI. So we call them the Anteater Virtues, and the idea is that all students at the UCI, hopefully, I mean, most at the moment it's most, hopefully eventually it'll be all students at some point will take these modules, which will help them develop their intellectual character. And what we're trying to do is hopefully embed that into the prison education as well. I mean, it would be nice to get in-person teaching too, but there are lots of practical hurdles of going into prisons for in-person teaching. So it may be that it starts off online. I don't know.
The curriculum was all online, I think, right?
Sorry?
The curriculum was all online that they kind of followed, or
No, well, in Scotland it was in person, all in person.
okay.
I mean, there were some videos and things that they got to watch, but in the end, we realized the video stuff was kind of not really contributing. It was the actual in-person classes that were making the difference.
Okay.
And I actually think they've got rid of the videos altogether now. For the project here with the curriculum project, there are some practical elements to it, personal elements, but a lot of it is you watch these modules and do some exercises and so on. Because of scale, you've got thousands of students, so it's difficult to think of ways of engaging with thousands of students. And so the next phase of this actually is to try and have the online modules be supplemented with in-class activities, make them more strategic. So the idea is they start off with online modules only, and as they work through, they have more and more in-person contact. So by the end, they have quite a lot of in-person contact, which I think is the best way to do it if you're doing it at scale. And what we'd like to do, I think, in the prisons is something like that. Give them online modules, but then follow it up with in-person classes. Because it really isn't about content, as I say. It is really about that kind of interactive engagement. And there's not so much you can do with that online. Really, that's got to be in person, I think.
Yeah, and that's where it goes into the difference between content-based curriculum versus kind of sensibility or sensible curriculum. But also kind of, and then it goes into a little bit where kind of we're saying you can have the critical reasoning skills. Someone can go to the academy and develop and study philosophy academically, but never have like I don't know, can always have a certain view about other views, look down on other views, or um, be very uncharitable to other views. And so that, and then that's the main contrast. My question, kind of moving forward, is that you had mentioned this has been done with children too. How is that? How is that? What does that look like? And how is that kind of done? Yeah.
Interestingly, what we use, the community of philosophical inquiry, was primarily that methodology was developed for children.
Oh,
Uh, and I know, as I say, we obviously wouldn't tell the prisoners this because so um, but and indeed it doesn't matter anyway because I've used it with university students. I think, but the reason why it's developed for students is precisely because it's a way of doing the sort of critical thinking without any kind of nothing you have to read, there's nothing you have to know, and so on. So that's why it's perfect for children. Um, we don't use any technical language at all. All the concepts, they're just talking about everyday things and so forth. Um, so yeah, that's what we use. And so what happens in the prison is roughly what we used to do in schools. I know. So here they have a program which I don't run. My colleague Mark Fiocco runs called Think, where they go into elementary schools or is it middle schools? I think not being American, it would be primary schools, the upper level of primary schools in the UK, which I think over here would make it the lower level of middle schools. But they go in and they do similar kinds of things. So it's not not community of philosophical inquiry specifically, but it's a very similar sort of thing where you go in, you pose certain kinds of problems, and then you get them to talk about it, and it's about getting them to start that process of collaborative thought. And your job as the philosopher in the room, as it were, is to facilitate that kind of discussion.
yeah, ideally, that's what it's supposed to be going, or what it's supposed to be doing. One of my friends who's a professor um, does that navigation as well when he's in a critical reasoning class, to the point where I think sometimes um, he's like, well, he'll have to intervene a little bit, and like, well, you have to give a little bit more, even though you disagree, that's fine, but like, what are your reasons, and kind of cultivating like, what are the reasons why? What do you the reasons why you believe what you're doing, or why do you think this person's incorrect about something? And I found like just doing that by myself is actually very difficult. It takes a lot of work. I
Yeah,
feel, and maybe that's just because I haven't done it for so long, but or like just kind of articulating your reasons at times, or like, why is it, why do I think that again? And then trying to either remember or recall, or just
yeah.
without just saying, well, that is just the case. That's just, here's the facts, or here's my claim, but not really like, okay, well, why is it that I think that again, or why do I think that's true?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting the extent to which one it can be surprised. Like things you've believed for a long time, and you feel like you have good reasons for them. When you start to think about, well, why do I believe it? And then you see the reasons are quite flimsy. Um, yeah, that's why it's really important to do this, and it's easier to do when you've got someone else, like
Mhm.
where it's interactive like that. Of course,
Mhm.
if you do it yourself, you can be easier on yourself than maybe you should be, and so on.
Yeah, perfect. All right. I'm trying to think if there's any other questions I have. I feel like we covered a big of our topic. Um, yeah, I don't know if I have anything more left. I appreciate having our conversation though.
Yeah, that was fun.
All right. If you don't mind letting people know um, where they can find you, any of your work.
So basically, everything's on my webpage, which I think is duncanpritchard.org, I think. Um, but yeah, I'm lucky in the internet age of having a name, which is if you put in Duncan Pritchard philosophy, I think Google just comes up with me. So that's regret. People didn't know, did they, those years ago, that names were going to be important like that? It's terrible to be John Smith or something. Yeah, so very lucky. Duncan Pritchard, I think it's duncanpritchard.org. And all my papers and everything is up there, and that links to anything you could be interested in. And my email's up there too. You can drop me a line, dhpritch@uci.edu if you have any questions.
Yeah, perfect. And then all those will be in the description below, so people can check out your work and check out the things you've written on. Because I found it valuable, and it continually helps me think about just nature of knowledge. And because I tell you before, I was reading some of your work. was like, yeah, like I've had the dismissive like, well, who cares about knowledge then? Whatever. I don't have knowledge. Okay, sure, but I have my beliefs, and I think I'm justified. So um,
Yeah.
yeah, so that's helped me kind of at least re come back and rethink about it and think about what's going on there.
Another thing about that view is, which I didn't mention before, but it's hard to be justified without if you don't know anything. If you think about it, right? I mean, the idea that you have all these beliefs and they're all justified, but you don't know anything. It was like, well, when you think about what justification is, it usually consists of things that you know.
Hmm.
So it's probably hard to just have justification. It's what's called the Russellian retreat. Bertrand Russell had that idea. This idea, maybe not, maybe we don't have knowledge, maybe we only have justified belief.
Hmm.
But one of the big comebacks is to say, well, hang on, what grounds of justification then if it's not knowledge? So probably you're committed, even if you think that, to thinking you do know lots of things, because otherwise you wouldn't be justified. And of course, that would be a disaster, right?
Is it kind of like so? Let's say um, like I'm having a conversation. I know I'm having, or let's say I have the justification. I'm having a conversation, and I have the belief that I'm having a conversation. Kind of that the me having the conversation is kind of justifying in some way, but it's not. Maybe it's not sufficient enough.
Well, yeah. I
Um,
mean, what's your reason for thinking you're having the conversation? Is it that you're having experiences of having the conversation or whatever? But then, do you not know that you're having the? I mean, there's nothing against
um,
you or anything about that. And if you didn't, right? Well, that's if there really is something preventing you from knowing that you're having experiences of having, well, then there seems the reasons have disappeared altogether, right? If you don't even have that. So it looks like lots of things that would be justifiers. If they're justifiers at all, they better be things that you know. Uh, so yeah, so it's
hmm,
the Russellian retreat's hard to make stable, right? Because you've got to somehow get it. So there's all these reasons that are justifying, but none of them amount to knowledge.
okay, yeah, I'll have to think more about that because
Yeah,
yeah, that's something I never really considered because I'm just like, okay, well, hmm, okay, I'll have to think about that. But, all right, well, perfect. Well, Dr. Pritchard, thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate talking with you. It's always a pleasure.
yeah, it's great. Thanks very much, Jacob.
And that concludes another episode. See you next time.